Okay, today I want to talk about, um, dive a little bit into the different generations of, especially Americans, but the generations of people born within the last, 120 years around that. I think the greatest generation goes back to about 1901. So technically, the entire 1900s and the 2000s. We're not going to dive into everything today. This is definitely a broader topic that I am going to be doing more videos on. Um, but we're basically going to break down a little bit of the generations, especially going from the baby boomer generation to, maybe Gen Z today. So one of the biggest things that I've heard boomers especially say today is that, because I think they're reflecting on how they raised their children now that a lot of them are older, middle aged, and retirement age, and they're looking at their children, the millennials, and some of the Gen X children born in that generation. They're looking at them as though they're very weak and they're not able to, really keep up with the way they grew up in their generation. Now, each generation is naturally going to be a little bit more weaker and passive and sensitive than the previous generation, just because they didn't have to endure the difficulties that that generation did. But I've heard a lot of baby boomers, especially, say that they're not leaving their children anything. They're leaving their children stuff, but only when they pass away. And they're going to make sure that their children struggle and go through the same type of difficulties that they did in order to, get to the places that they're at today, right? I disagree with that argument. I disagree with that philosophy or ideology, however you want to call it. I disagree with that because, number one, that's not really what America was supposed to be. The American dream was that you could either come to this country, or if you were born here, you could start from nothing and you could basically build an empire just on your work ethic, your ability to, convince people of your vision, your charisma, and able to be in order to be able to sell things, your product, your service, whatever. And so many people have done that in this country since, its founding and even before that. Um, but for some reason, the boomer generation, a shift happened with them. I guess it had to do with the 60s and that whole hippie era, where people got detached from following in the pattern that their parents had laid out. A lot of the previous generations before them had always kind of followed in their parents' footsteps naturally and just went with that status quo. The boomers were like the first generation to really break away from their parents and go off to do bigger and better things, which is a good thing because our children are supposed to do better than us. But the bad thing is they went off on their own and they isolated themselves and detached themselves from their parents a lot of the times, not in every case. And I'm sure there's people who have great stories about how they, followed in their parents' footsteps, especially in the boomer generation. So I'm not saying this is a one size fits all or that this is blanketed across the generation, that it applies to everybody, because it doesn't. But what I will say is that there is a recurring theme with the boomer generation. A lot of them have kind of gone off away from their parents, done better than them economically, financially, acquiring more assets. In a lot of ways, they did better than their parents. In many ways, they did worse than their parents' generation. The boomers have had a lot less children than their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation. Those generations, the greatest generation and the silent generation, the small generation right after them, um, a lot of them have had many more children than the boomer generation. The boomer generation, average is not that many. It's more than their children, Gen X, and the millennials, but it's a lot less than their parents. So, maybe the greatest generation and the silent generation were having, like, I don't know the exact numbers right now, but I would say it was probably somewhere around like 7 or 8 kids. Some had a dozen, some had more than that. I personally know people in that generation that have had 19 children, and then some had, maybe one or two. So it varies, but it was definitely like a higher single digit number, seven, eight, nine, something like that. The boomer generation, I think the average was like, I want to say three or four. I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to look at that. And maybe in future episodes, when we do go deeper in this conversation, we will. But they had a lot less children because they dedicated their time to different things. They wanted to leave what their parents had built and go off and build their own things in life. But a lot of that was moving from blue collar jobs to white collar jobs and going from the middle class to the rich class. And a lot of that started with the boomer generation. A lot of that started from that time frame. So we'll take a quick look at it here, and then we're going to talk a little bit more. We're going to just do a quick overview of the generations, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about you know the way that boomers are kind of doing things a little differently than they have always been done in America, and how it's really negatively impacting their children's generations. Um, so we'll get into this, like I said, in deeper conversation in the future. But right now, let's just take a look at this quickly. So these are the different generations. Um, they typically range from 1901. Some people say 1900. Some people say 1902 or whatever. So give or take a couple of years, everybody's kind of got a different idea as the actual uh dates for each generation. And I don't know exactly when this started becoming something that we measured, but um, it's definitely uh, probably the greatest generation is the first generation that we really started, you know, monitoring and measuring this. So essentially, the greatest generation, 1901 to 1927, that generation, and typically generations will go in 18-year blocks. Not always, but it depends on the time period. And the reason that was because by the time people were 18, they were at a legal age to start, going out in the world and doing adult things. And one of those things was getting married and having kids. So they would begin creating the next generation. So it would typically be like an 18-year block. And that's not a one size fits all. It doesn't apply to everything. If you look here at the boomers, that's an 18-year block. But this right here, greatest generation, that's a 26-year block. So it does range. However, this generation, that was your, World War I era generation. That was your beginning of the 1900s Industrial Revolution generation. I mean, those people basically took America from what it was originally founded as, a bunch of agricultural, colonial or colonist type people who were very grassroots, just building the country on their backs, manual labor, all that stuff, and then kind of growing it from there to slightly bigger and better things. I mean, there wasn't that many industrial revolution type industries that had came out of nowhere up until that point, up until the early 1900s, except for a few things in the 1800s, like the railroad, steam engines, and things that basically kicked off the Industrial Revolution. Post Civil War, that's when things really started changing because the war was over. We had a ton of rebuilding to do in this country. And, usually after a war, there's a huge era of explosive growth and advancement technologically, industrially, whatever, because people are done fighting and they kind of have decided on what the conclusion is of that argument. And now they're dedicating their time and energy to building and growing and either rebuilding what was destroyed during the war or growing from that point, because now that problem has solved itself. It's out of the way. And right before that time, you usually see the country in a major decline. You see it in, shambles. People are divided. There's a lot of, growth that's slowed down or stopped. And if you notice, we're actually at that point again in history. So I'm not saying we're headed to a civil war, but it is possible. There's a lot of tension in this country. There's a lot of things that are going on that are, leading up to um, a possible, some sort of implosion, explosion, whatever, of all this frustration. The economy's down very bad, and we've been like this for a while now. We had the crash in the late 90s going into the early 2000s, the dot-com boom and bust. We had the 2001, there was a small economic crash from 9/11, the World Trade Centers, that whole situation. There was 2003 was pretty rough too, because you had the war in Iraq that had begun, and now that war was pulling a lot of resources into it and taking it from our economy. Um, and then you had 2008, the housing market crash, huge financial, decline in this country. We literally went into a depression. Many, economists and people will tell you that we were just in a recession, but that's not true. We were in a major depression. And, you really can't lie to people. They can see it, they can feel it. And that's essentially what we're in now. That happened, during COVID for a very brief time, but only because they shut down the economy. But if you look at the last 2 years, 2023 and 2024 have been horrible recession years. Yes, the stock market has been up at times, but unemployment has increased. It actually went down because of COVID, then went back up when everybody was allowed to go back to work. And that was for about 2 years or so, 2020, late 2020 to 21, 22. Those were decent years because of that slowly coming back of the economy from, turning back on the machine. But 23 and 24 were not great years. In fact, I think the economy, especially the stock market, hit like a very, not an all-time low, but a low for a very significant period of time in like October of 23. So we're definitely in a decline right now, and things are not going well, especially under this, you know, uh, whatever you want to call this presidency with Biden and Kamala Harris. Um, Things are not going well, and we're heading into another presidential election in less than 40 days. So there's a lot of economic instability around that. But we are in a, basically a recessionary period again. So, who knows what is happening? And there's a lot of tension in this country. So we don't really know where this leads. The election holds a lot of weight, and the results of that, the outcome, there's a lot of people saying that it's going to be, stolen or rigged. And then there's people saying that, um, Trump's going to win in a landslide. So we really don't know which way this is going to go. Only God knows. And there's actually, beauty in that we don't know. We kind of have to just take it day by day. Um, but, you don't know what the outcome of this is going to be. And if it does lead to, turmoil or division, further division that we're already in this country, it could lead to an economic downturn even worse than what we're in now. And I predict either way it goes, we'll probably be going through difficult economic times, no matter who wins. Just because there's so much on the line, there's so many moving parts, and even if Trump gets in, there are going to be a lot of politicians or people who like the status quo, want to continue a certain trend to continue to get richer, that are going to try and stop a lot of what he's trying to do. Or if the other side, Kamala, gets in, they're going to implement policies and regulations that are going to further bring down this country, not to mention bleeding resources by giving them overseas to other countries to fight wars that we're not even technically involved in, but we kind of are. Um, so there's a lot going on. It does kind of mirror some of what life was like pre-Civil War. But then after that, back to my point, in the early 1900s, you had the Industrial Revolution. You had that generation. They really were the greatest generation. I mean, they catapulted us from an agricultural and a colonial type country to a bigger, nation. I mean, we went from being just this small country that broke away from the greatest superpower in the world at that time, Great Britain. And those people were just a bunch of militiamen, very simple, didn't really have the resources that Great Britain had. And they broke away, and they went from being this country that was, like I said, a lot of colonists, um, small villages, small towns, to building the greatest superpower in world history in a very short amount of time. And a lot of that was due to the greatest generation. These people born in the early 1900s, they industrialized this country like crazy. Tons of factories were built, new advancements technologically, products, all kinds of stuff. So they are called the greatest generation, and they kind of are in many ways. That's subjective, but they kind of they kind of are in many ways because they catapulted us to the next level to where we basically became the world's greatest superpower, and we still are today. We are in decline, and who knows what the future is going to bring. It could be the end of America, or it could be rebirth. But either way, we are going through interesting times. But the greatest generation, they helped bring us to that next level, right? So they laid the foundation. Then you had the silent generation. Um, Again, this was this was like the World War II generation. Um, but it was kind of they were a great generation as well. I mean, the World War II generation, we look at them as, you know, people who were, and don't get me wrong, a lot of these people were born from 1926 allegedly to 1945. The war basically ended in 45, so right around that time. So, many of those people didn't fight in World War II, but they were part of that uh, generation of people who were around during that time, were around when things were tough, when the world was scarier than it is today. And there are wars going on today. There is a lot of controversy with the election, but back then they were living in a time where there was huge threats from world dictators that were trying to take over the world, take over every country and conquer the world. They were at a literal world war where many, many different countries were involved in this massive war. And then, making advancements, industrially, technologically as well, on top of creating nuclear bombs for the first time, the atomic bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima. These were scary, tough times. And, those people that lived through that era were also very, tough and, had endured so much, and they learned from their parents. They had kind of carried the torch from what their parents had passed to them. So those generations really helped make this country what it is today, or at least was up until the late 1900s going into the 2000s. And there was a switch that happened. The boomer generation right here was born between 1946 and 64. So, up until that point, there was a lot of different things that went on in this country with during the greatest generation and the silent generations, eras. Um, but the country was mostly united, and most people were proud to be Americans, and most people were trying to build the American dream for themselves, right? And there's so much that we can go into there. But for the first time, the boomer generation was born, and things had shifted. It was post World War II. It was a different era where we were heading into a time of peace. Yes, you did have the Korean War and then eventually the Vietnam War, but those wars, the Vietnam War was a little different, but the Korean War was nothing after World War II. So, it was a big war, but compared to World War II at that time, the Korean War was like nothing. It was kind of like the Gulf War back in the 90s, right after Vietnam. People didn't even recognize it. They didn't even consider it a war. Um, you know, it would be like comparing a tropical storm to a hurricane. If you had a category whatever 5 or something hurricane, and then immediately, a few weeks after that you had a tropical storm, you wouldn't even think about it because the hurricane was so devastating. You're like, that was the big thing. Anything after that is nothing because we endured that, right? So the boomers, they were kind of going through this um, change economically, and something happened. Something changed where you had a lot of people for the first time going to college, and that was during the boomer generation. Not as many people would go to college before them, but you had a lot of people during that time going to college. There was a big push for it. And you also had a lot of people during that time that were getting into uh, a cultural revolution, the hippie movement of the 60s. Um, Times were good economically during the 50s, so people were able to live better lives and move up in the world. People were moving out of blue collar jobs and into white collar jobs. Um, People were buying homes, getting 1 or 2 cars. Things were really good during that time. We think things are good now because we do have a lot more um, items and materialistic things in the world than we did back then. But you'd be surprised. There's a lot of cool inventions that were invented back during that time in the 40s and 50s and 60s that we don't even have today, and they're so efficient and effective. If they were made today, just made a little bit more modern, they would be incredible. But we don't have that. We're very cookie cutter today, and the quality of things has gone down dramatically. That were built in the 40s and 50s and 60s, some of those things are still around today, and they're still in phenomenal shape. We have stuff today that's made to break. It doesn't last past your lucky 10 years. Um, there is stuff from the 50s today that still exists. That's over 70 years. There are toys that are made of solid metal that are still around today, 70 years later. I highly doubt in 70 years from now, the stuff that we have today is going to still be functional or even worth anything in the future because it's just not made well today. So the quality's diminished. So along with that, you had, that generation kind of moving away from the American dream in a different way. They were moving into the idea that you should try to attain material wealth over building the American dream, building the foundation, and then passing that on to your children. So this is kind of the bigger point that I'm going to get through today, hopefully. But essentially, a lot of the baby boomer generation moved away from what their parents had to offer them and then decided to go their own way, get specific jobs, either, like I said, going from a blue collar job to a white collar job or whatever, starting a business, whatever. And they decided to put their money in, assets that the previous generations didn't really consider assets. So they would move their money away from gold and silver and they would put it into dollars because at the time there was a lot of changing with, in the 30s with FDR and gold, and then also in the 70s with the money being taken off the gold standard. But then you also had a lot of people who started investing their money into their home as that being their main asset. And then you eventually had, people of that generation go into the workforce and start getting into, paper assets like stocks and, bonds and, different types of securities. And that has been around for a while. It's been around since the beginning of the 1900s. So the greatest generation had access to that stuff too. But it became much more, popular, especially during the 80s, that whole Wall Street movement. And people would put their money into stuff like that. And then eventually that led to 401ks and people looking at getting jobs that had pensions and investing for the long term, instead of going and building the American dream, looking for someone to kind of hand it to them. Now, that doesn't mean that getting a job is, in any way bad or someone else handing you something, but they got away from the true Americana philosophy of building your own way, and they relied on going an easier route, looking for a shiny object at the end of the rainbow if they just kind of coast, right? Take a job, get a 401k or a pension, get those small raises on the way, get involved in a union and, things like that. And I think seeing a lot of them today start to realize that a lot of that stuff doesn't really work. A lot of it is actually social programs from social, governments, socialistic type governments, communist governments, in order to, I wouldn't say totally enslave people, but just sort of keep them happy with the status quo. Give them a baseline, make them comfortable, and then they won't want to advance to the next level, right? It's, like a nice, soft, comfortable, bed that you can sink into, and you really don't want to get up in the morning. You just want to sleep and relax and enjoy. Sometimes a firmer mattress is better because it's not as comfortable, but it forces you to get up in the morning and get going because you don't want to lay around in the bed all day. It's not as comfortable. So not being comfortable can be a very motivating and powerful tool. Keep that in mind in the future if you're ever, thinking that your life is not going the way that you want it to go. Maybe you're too comfortable. Maybe it's not that your life, sucks or is horrible. Maybe it's just that you're a little too comfortable where you are. You have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. So that being said, um, they, just kind of changed the way that they thought about things, and they accumulated their wealth in, I wouldn't say a completely selfish way. I would just say a very different way. But what they're doing with it now seems to be very selfish. So, previously the generations would take their wealth, they build it up, and then they pass it down to their children, either in life while they were still alive and their children, as well, and coach them through how to take that on and manage it. But the boomer generation did things differently. They went to get a job, they went to college, they got out, they got a career, they worked their way up the ladder, and then they retired. They had their home. Maybe they bought two or three along the way. Sold one, bought another one, and kept rolling that into what the house that they lived in when they retired. And now a lot of them are at the point where they're in retirement age. I think there was something like 10,000 baby boomers retire every day. I'm not sure if that number is exactly correct, but it's a very significantly high number, and they are the biggest generation today living by population. You know, because they literally, the baby boomer generation. They were a huge generation, tons of kids born. I mean, they're called the baby boomer generation because there was an explosion of births that had happened during that time. A lot of these greatest generation and silent generation people had given birth to tons of kids during that baby boomer generation. So, they are just doing things differently with their wealth, and they're not really passing it on to their children. Previously, generations would, you know, go for the American dream, build a business from the ground up, and then teach their child that business, teach them all life lessons that they needed to know how to manage that business, bring them into it. They'd buy a land, a home, whatever, teach them all about that, taking care of the land, and then leave that to, let them stay there or live there or build their home on there. And then, leave that all to them when they went, and now they would be able to take that on and then build on top of that. And some people have done this. Some big companies that exist today are 3, 4, 5 generation. And, they just kept teaching each generation the skills on how to manage that thing and left it to them. And then they would build on top of that and keep growing it. That's why some of these companies today are big. I mean, Coca-Cola is around for over 100 years now. And it's not in the same family, but that thing has been passed through the generations. I personally know people that are third, fourth, fifth generation in their business that their great great grandfather, whatever, left them, down the lineage. Um, so my point is they started doing things differently. They started um, taking their wealth and kind of building up a nest that was different than what we had seen in America in the past, but also was kind of designed for them to retire versus building something that um, could be a foundation for their children to build on top of, like laying the concrete foundation of a building, and then the next generation builds the first floor, and the next generation builds the second floor. And before you know it, 5, 6, 7, whatever generations down the line, you have a building, you have an actual skyscraper or something, right? And that's really what the American dream is in a nutshell. It's not just building the dream for yourself, living a lavish life of like celebrity, like we are, programmed to think is the life for us today. So many young people, especially, they're seeking celebrity with social media and Instagram and all that stuff. And, that's not what the American dream ever was supposed to be. It was supposed to be you come here or you were born here, you start from nothing, no problem. You build and you grow, and then you pass down to your children and they continue that, and everybody keeps building and building and building until we have this great nation filled with people who are multi-generational, and it just keeps going from there. That was the idea. That was part of the American dream, and it's changing today, but especially with the boomer generation retiring. So I'm going to jump over to this real quick, and then we're going to go back to that. Um, let's just switch screens here. So I want to show you this. This is a website called Statista. They do a lot of different type of statistics, but I have seen other, statistics that show very similar. Essentially, what you're looking at is the wealth distribution in this country, based on the generations, right? So the silent generation, that's the oldest generation that's still living today. Not as many people left, but they do still hold 13% of the wealth because they've just been around forever. And like I said, a lot of them had some stuff passed down to them from their parents' generation, or they built it themselves with the idea of the American dream. And they are still around, and they're, holding some of that wealth to live on until they pass away. But what you should see is each generation's slice getting bigger as the generations get younger, not the youngest. So you don't see Gen Z in here because a lot of them are still kids today. So they didn't accumulate really any wealth yet. They're still very young. A lot of them are in college still or just coming out of college. So they're not going to be considered in this. But these generations, this is how it breaks down. The silent generation, you would think, would have either the smallest or the second smallest because they have built their wealth, but the generation has shrunk a lot over time since a lot of them have passed away by now, especially if they were born in going back as far as 1926. They would be almost 100 years old by now. Not that many people live to 100. I think the average age in America is like 78. So many of those people have passed away since. That slice of the pie is going to shrink just naturally because population for that generation has shrunken. The boomers should be, you would think, about double what the silent generation is because they're at the age where they built their wealth in life. They're older. A lot of them are retiring now, but they're also a bigger generation population-wise than the other generations. So that makes sense that it would be, maybe at least double the size of the silent generation. That they're a slice of the pie, but it's actually half. It's over half. It's 51%. Now, you could say a lot of that has to do with that generation being a significantly large number of people, and that would make sense. But they shouldn't be this much of the pie. They should be, maybe a third of the entire pie because they are the biggest generation. Many of them are still alive today, and a lot of them they're at that age where they've pretty much worked their whole life, accumulated their wealth, and are now going into retirement age. The next generation down, Gen X, they're the ones that are right in the middle. Some of them are at the age where they're starting to retire, depending on how old they are, and some of them are at the age where they're, still working, have, young children, but they've been working for a couple decades now and have accumulated a lot of wealth themselves. The millennial generation is so small. It's smaller than the silent generation. And by this point now, I would say it's safe to say the population of the millennials is greater than the silent generation. I think they're the second biggest population. They're actually bigger than Gen X in terms of numbers of people born into that generation. So I think the millennials are actually second next to the boomers for how many of them there are population-wise compared to the other generations and living today. The millennial slice is so small. Most of the boomers' children are actually millennials. So if you look at the, ages, 1926 to 45 is the silent generation, and then 46 is the beginning of the boomers. So there are some people in the greatest generation that had children that are boomers, but a lot of them were silent generation that gave birth to them because by the time, their 1945 rolls around, the silent generation's basically 18 at the bare minimum from the first person born into that generation. And back then they had children young. So they're giving birth to the boomers. The last people in that generation, 1945, and the Gen X generation begins in 65. That's not for another 20 years after that generation is born. So most people that are Gen X and millennial, their parents are, boomers. I'd say it's a 50-50 split, maybe a little bit more millennial 60-40 than Gen X. I'd have to look at the actual numbers, but these two generations, millennial and Gen X, their parents are mostly boomers. These boomers are retiring now, and they're selling their homes, downsizing, moving into a smaller house, relocating to a less expensive part of the country or into a retirement home, whatever. a lot of them are taking their wealth out of their assets now that they're in retirement age, and they're actually spending it on themselves. Now, this is not the case for everybody, and if you're not that type of person and you're part of the boomer generation, great for you. That is really wonderful to hear. But a lot of boomers notoriously, and it's actually all over social media now, it's kind of become common knowledge, are taking vacations, taking long trips, making up for when they were younger and they worked so hard. Now they want to enjoy their spoils, the stuff that they've accumulated over their lifetime from working, but they're not taking any of that and giving it back to their children. Many of them are saying they're not even leaving their children anything because they want them to struggle the way that they did and come up, the same way and have that grit and endurance and everything. And many of them are leaving their children stuff, but only after they die. So they're going to leave them things that many of them have not taught their children how to manage and take on from them. They're going to leave them those things, and then they're not even going to be there to help them take them over because they're going to be dead already. And their children are going to have these, assets or whatever money that they're not going to know how to properly manage or reinvest for their future. It's kind of a not really a intelligent system designed to pass on your wealth to the future generation and help them build on top of the foundation that you laid. Now, this again is not every case for every baby boomer, but this is actually considered the norm. Many of them are going this way. They are taking their wealth, pulling it out of the market, pulling it out of whatever. And then not only are they doing that, they're not even selling those assets to their children. So you could say they should pass them on, but some people will say they need the money because they held those assets their whole life. Now they need to pull that money out so that they can live off of it in their retirement. A lot of them are not even selling that stuff to their children. They're selling it to the open marketplace. So instead of selling your home to your child, maybe, some people feel, oh, I have multiple kids. How can I sell it to one over the others or whatever? They're selling it to the open marketplace and they're dividing that stuff up to their children. Or some of them, especially some of the more, rich or elite people, like Bill Gates and whoever else, are saying that they're not really leaving their children anything. They're just going to, leave them with, hey, come and, make it the way that I did, start from the bottom. So I disagree with that. And now we can jump out of here, look at some of this other stuff later. And like I said, in future videos, we're going to look at, we're going to go delve deeper into the different generations and really get down to, what's been going on in this country for the last 100 years or so, and dig deeper into the generations. Because I think that there are a lot of, people in this country that have been impacted by the change in ideology that a lot of people adopted that were born in the boomer generation than their parents' generations, the silent generation, and the greatest generation. There was a, ideological shift that happened in this country. We went from being a country that was completely free. The mindset was the American dream, freedom, God, country, all that stuff first, family, and then, other things along the way, to now where we are basically a socialist country headed towards communism, or at least at the bare minimum, a dictatorship, authoritarian, totalitarianism, whatever. But we are headed down a completely different path than the founders had laid out for us. I disagree with the philosophy of taking your wealth if you're born in the baby boom generation and you've accumulated all that wealth. I disagree with the philosophy of taking that and pulling it out and selling it into the marketplace, selling those assets, collecting the money, and then, running off into the sunset to retire, right? As parents, we're really supposed to not only build and accumulate wealth for ourselves, but for our children too. And that doesn't just mean when you pass away, you leave them things. You want to build that foundation with them and for them. You want to build and leave a legacy, right? At least that's what the American dream was partially, founded on. You want to pass down not just your wealth and your assets or whatever to your children, but the knowledge and the life lessons that you learn too. a lot of boomers from that generation, they stopped teaching their children things and they started to let the world raise their children. Before that generation, the greatest generation, the silent generation, they were very involved in their children's lives. Not completely, there was definitely, some parents just weren't good parents, or they ignored their children or left their children or were alcoholics or whatever. I'm not saying it was perfect, but they were definitely more involved in their children's upbringing than the boomer generation in certain ways where it counted. They would teach them life lessons. Yeah, they were hard on them, but they put them through things that would teach them to overcome. Versus the boomer generation that's notorious for letting the world raise their children, letting the school systems, the government get involved and have their hands in the parenting process, and then just giving them material things, taking their money and buying them material things, thinking that that was going to be better than giving them the life lessons and the moral values that their parents taught and left to them. So you gotta, the mindset should be, and it's a little late for some of the boomers now because it's too late. You're older, you've lived your life, you've raised your children, and they're out on their own doing their own thing. This is really more a message for Gen X. It's still not too late for you, but also the millennials that are now becoming parents today, at least for the last 10 years. And even Gen Z, you're young, you're just coming out of college, or you're still in college. Keep this in mind going forward for when you do start to have a family and plan for that part of your life. But you want to build your children up and you want to take them on that ride with you. And you want to lay the foundation for them, but you don't want to have them, leave them with nothing, or, worse either way, leave them with what you built, but didn't teach them anything about how to manage or to take care of it, or leave them, with nothing and just expect them to start from the same place you started. And I've heard this argument a lot with especially boomers. They'll say things like, we want our children to, they're not tough, they're weak, they're snowflakes, whatever. And they are, not able to do the things we did because they don't have grit, endurance, whatever. And I've heard a lot of boomers make this argument and say, we want our children to kind of struggle and start from square one. The problem with that mindset is if you started from square one and you make your children start from square one and they continue that trend with their children, no one will ever get away from square one. No one will ever break away from level one to level two. It'll be nonstop, just people staying at that level, right? Staying at that place. And if that was the mindset of this country, we would have never grown from colonies. We would have never grown from the Puritans coming here and literally building everything from scratch, right? That would be like if the boomers were part of the Puritan generation saying, we don't want our children to get spoiled with all this nice stuff, so we're going to knock everything down when we're done, and, they're going to rebuild it all. Or if we started that today, saying, you know what, forget all the roads, forget all the highways, the bridges, the tunnels, the, water towers, power plants, factories, all the stuff that runs society that we function on, computers, everything. Delete it all, erase it all, knock it all down, and let each generation rebuild all that stuff. That would never work. We would never get away from square one. We would continue the same cycle and not grow. You need growth in the world. You need growth as a nation. You need growth as a generation. You need to keep building on what your parents have laid out for you. One generation builds the foundation. Like I said, the next generation builds the first floor, the next generation, the second floor. And before you know it, you have a tower, right? So I disagree with the logic that a lot of boomers have said, but I think a lot of them have also made that decision out of fear of failure or, whatever, that their children would become spoiled, which is ironic because a lot of them have raised such spoiled, coddled children. That's why they're soft, snowflakes, or however they put it, is because they were coddled. If they were treated like their parents treated them, they would be a lot tougher today and be able to endure and handle things a lot better. But a lot of them are very soft and weak because their parents had coddled them out of fear of, them being weak. So it was like this weird, solution to a problem that didn't actually occur until they created it. If you go back to the Bible and you look at Genesis and you read the whole story of how that all came about, God's plan was to create people, to have a family, to have, children that he created in his image. And he left his children, Adam and Eve, everything. Aside from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he left them the entire Garden of Eden. He left them the entire world. He left them all the other creations that he made, the animals, the bugs, the plants, everything. He left it to his children. So if it was God's plan to leave everything to his children, why would it not be man's plan, mankind's plan to leave everything for their children and continue that cycle? Isn't that what a loving parent would do? But you don't just leave it to them. You leave it to them and teach them how to manage it, teach them how to properly take care of it so that they know and can continue to grow on it and then pass that down to their children. And each generation grows on that. So the point here is simple. I would just say that if you're, and it might be a little too late for some of you. I do understand that because, sometimes hindsight's 2020, but you can't go back in time. It is what it is. You just have to live with it. But for the people in the boomer generation that are older now, you're retiring or you're retired and you're looking to cash out, instead of taking your assets to the marketplace, selling them, and by the way, this is something that could significantly change the trajectory of America going forward. What you do with your, stuff really does matter. It sets your children up on a trajectory that will either benefit them and their future generations of children or actually hurt them. Don't take your assets and go to the marketplace and sell them. Go to your children. Leave to them what you can leave to them now before you pass away so that you can coach them through how to properly manage those things the way that you did, and they can build on that. Or sell it to them. If you really need the money, sell it to them. Let them buy it, and they'll pay the money just, like any other person on the open marketplace would. But at least they'll have the pride and I wouldn't say pride from a worldly sense, but the satisfaction that they're not just buying something, they're buying something that their parents built and that they can build on top of. There's there's something to that. There's something to being able to say, this was my father's or my grandfather's or whoever, and I get to now build on this and then pass it down to my children, even if you make them buy it because you do want them to be tough and have to go through some level of struggle and not have everything handed to them on a silver platter. That's fine. Just give it to them first before you put it on the open marketplace. Because also, too, a lot of times, who buys things on the open marketplace? It's not the average person. It's the big conglomerates that already have everything and they just want to conquer the whole world, right? But if you keep passing things on to your children and their children, it keeps the American dream alive. It keeps the nation free. It keeps, small businesses the backbone of this country. And it stops monopolies from taking over the America and making this a corporatocracy, which what it kind of is now. There are open monopolies right now that we just let get away with, even though there's anti-monopoly laws in place. Many politicians don't even act on them because they're either in bed with those big corporations or they just don't want to bother them because they want, backing from them for an election or something. So I would say just consider this. The boomer generation, you have half the wealth in the entire country. You probably don't need all of that. Pass some of it on to your children now. Teach them how to, take that thing and run with it and build upon it and give them a sense of, again, like I said, not pride from a worldly perspective, but appreciation that they now have something that they can not only bond with you with while you're still alive, but build on top of and continue that going forward for the future generations. This could really change the trajectory of your children. A lot of millennials are, still kind of trying to figure out what they want to do for a living. And some of them are in their 30s and 40s and they're not happy at this job. So they move to that job and they try that out for a few years. Sometimes it's best to just tell your children, hey, this is what we're doing in this family. If you want to join in, here you go. Now build on that. Especially if you have a business and you're a baby boomer that has a business and you're looking to retire. Do everything you can to convince your children to take that from you, because it'll, like I said, it'll keep that machine going. It'll keep it going for the generations moving forward, instead of just having the open marketplace or some big conglomerate buy it up and, take it over. And that's pretty much what's happening now. Everything's being absolved into something bigger that's just becoming this huge mega machine, until there's like five companies that run the entire country, and that's it. There's no other companies. We don't want that. This is not idiocracy where you have one company. Um, Although we are kind of headed that way. But just, something to keep in mind, especially when you're going into retirement. Think about that a little differently. And if you're Gen X and you're a little bit older and you're looking at that point, see what you can do now to help your children get set up in the right direction. Build a legacy for your children. Build a legacy for them to take on and carry on with them, and then build on top of and continue that trend ongoing for hopefully indefinitely, right? Well, let's hope America keeps going forever. But that is a huge part of the American dream. And I personally would like to see it continue to stay alive. I still believe the American dream exists today, and I believe that, you can attain it too. It's harder now, but it's still possible. And if you work with the right people and you are able to, build a community, you can definitely attain it. But even on your own, you can too. You're just gonna have to work a little bit harder. So that's it for this video. It's just a quick one, but we are going to go into depth on this topic definitely in the future. The different generations, and a lot of, breaking that whole thing, unpacking that whole, situation, because I feel like it's played a major role in this country today with the generations and how they're coming up, how they're being raised, and how it's affecting America and the future of this nation. We are definitely living in interesting times, and some might even say biblical times. But that's it for this video. Definitely stay tuned for the next one. Check out the other ones on here. All the information, links in my bio, in the show notes. Don't forget to, like everybody always says, like, subscribe, follow, share, all that stuff. It really does help grow the channel so that I can continue making content for you. And also, if there's topics that you want me to talk about or touch on, definitely put it in the comments or even direct message me, whatever works for you. I do try to read everything and respond as quickly as I can. But yeah, definitely, put that stuff out there. Let me know what you're looking for. And we're going to talk about a lot of topics on this channel. You can even check the show notes for the different type of topics that we are going to go over. And, maybe think of something that you think you'd like to see on one of those categories. But that's it for this video. Stay tuned for the next one. All right, so I just want to take a quick moment and talk to you about my children's book, Little Boy Full of Love. This is Little Boy Full of Love, book I wrote, and that's me on the back. And this is a sneak peek on the inside. So it's a great book. I wrote this book for my son. It's a children's book, obviously. It's available right now on a lot of online platforms: Amazon, Walmart, Barnes & Noble, Indigo, bookshop.org, and a lot of other platforms, like I said. But more importantly for me, at least I think, it's available in a lot of physical bookstores throughout the country. I love small businesses. I love bookstores. I love to see that there are many that are still around, even though things have changed with the internet age. And like I said, a lot of big conglomerates buying up the little bookstores, but there are still a lot that do exist across the country. And the book is in, I think, about 15 or 16 different states now. So, there may be a bookstore local to you that it's available in. If you want to get the book and you want to support a local business at the same time, check my Instagram page to find out which stores may be near you that are carrying the physical book, and go in there, call them on the phone and order it. And, that's just, like I said, a great way we can continue to support small business in this country, because they were and they should continue to be the backbone of America. But if you can't, check out our Amazon storefront. It's available on there, along with a lot of other products that we, actually personally use in our daily lives and recommend to you. And they're all listed in there by category, so you can shop specifically for categories that interest you. But check out the Amazon storefront, check out the apparel shop, all that stuff, like I said, is in my bio, the show notes, everywhere, very easily accessible. We're on YouTube, Rumble, Instagram, all that stuff. So check it out, and stay tuned for the next one.